My name is Laura Mackenzie, and the night my husband laughed and told me to call my old man, he never imagined the police chief would answer. The sound of my own breath was loud in my ears. I can still hear it, sharp, uneven, almost embarrassed to exist. David stood in the kitchen of the house we had lived in for 38 years, the same kitchen where I had canned peaches every August and baked birthday cakes for our children. He had just struck me, not hard enough to send me across the room, hard enough to cross a line. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Go on," he said. "Call your old man. Let's see what the farmer's going to do about it." He said farmer the way some people say fool. I tasted blood where my teeth had caught the inside of my cheek. My hands were shaking, but not the way they used to when I was afraid of upsetting him. This was different. Something steadier had taken hold. I walked to the hallway table and picked up the phone. He followed me, still smirking. "That's right. Call him. Tell him his little girl needs help." I dialed the number I had known since I was 5 years old. It rang once. "Police chief here." The words were calm, professional, familiar. My throat tightened. "Dad, save me." There was a pause. Not confusion, not surprise. Just a shift in tone I had heard before when I was a child, and someone had scraped a knee or fallen off a bicycle. "Are you safe right now?" he asked. "I'm in the house." "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." 5 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It was firm, not angry, not hesitant. The knock of someone who knew they had authority and no need to raise their voice. That was the moment everything changed. But to understand that night, you have to understand the years before it. David and I married in 1986 in a small church outside Kingston, Ontario. My father had already spent 20 years on the force by then, though most people in town still thought of him as the boy who helped his father on the family farm. He never corrected them. Titles were never important to him. David started his HVAC business out of our garage. I kept the books at the kitchen table after the children went to bed. I answered customer calls between loads of laundry. When the business grew, I learned QuickBooks at the public library. When the trucks needed cleaning, I cleaned them. When he was tired, I told him he could do it. We built something solid, or so I believed. Our daughter moved to Calgary after university. Our son settled in Halifax with his own family. The house grew quieter. David grew louder. Success had sharpened something in him. He began correcting the way I spoke at dinners with clients. He would mention almost jokingly that I had grown up on a dirt road. He started making decisions without asking me even about money we had earned together. The first time he called my father, that old farmer, was at a Christmas dinner 5 years ago. I remember the look on my father's face, not offended, just disappointed. "Your dad's still playing cop?" David had asked one evening, years after my father had become chief. "He's not playing," I had said quietly. "He is the chief." David had laughed, thinking I was teasing. I never corrected him properly. I suppose part of me liked that my father wore his authority lightly. Part of me also feared what David would do with that knowledge. The emotional distance grew slowly. Small comments, sharp glances, apologies that sounded like instructions. I told myself all marriages change with age. I told myself he was under stress. I told myself our children didn't need to worry. Silence became a habit. That night, the argument started over something ordinary. A check I had questioned, a transfer I didn't recognize. He accused me of doubting him. I said I was only asking. He raised his voice. I raised mine. And then his hand rose. The moment after he struck me was almost worse than the strike itself. He looked surprised at his own action, then embarrassed, then defensive. Well, maybe that'll make you listen. I felt something settle inside me. Not fear, not fury, clarity. He mocked my family because he believed I had none who could stand up to him. He believed the girl from the farm would stay quiet. When the knock came at the door, David's smirk faded. He looked toward the front hallway, confused. "Who's that?" I did not answer. He walked to the door and opened it. My father stood there, in his dark coat, his badge clipped discreetly at his belt. 2 officers from the township stood just behind him. Snow had begun to fall lightly across the porch light. "Evening," my father said calmly. "We received a call." David's face drained of color. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. My father did not look at him first. He looked at me. "Laura, are you injured?" "No." "Do you feel safe?" I swallowed. "I do now." The officers stepped inside. They spoke to David quietly, professionally. There was no shouting, no spectacle, just procedure. David kept glancing at me, as though waiting for me to laugh, and say it had all been dramatic nonsense. I did not laugh. As he was escorted outside to speak further with the officers, he turned once more. "You called him?" "Yes," I said, "I did." The door closed behind them. The house felt larger than it had in years. My father stepped inside and removed his hat. "You should have called sooner," he said gently. I looked at the kitchen clock ticking above the stove. 38 years of marriage and 5 minutes to change it. The knock still echoed in my mind, not as a threat, but as a boundary finally drawn. I did not yet know what would follow the paperwork, the conversations, the long nights of reflection. But I knew one thing with certainty. Silence had protected the wrong person for far too long. The night my father stood on our porch snow, gathering along the shoulders of his coat, I realized something I had refused to admit. For years, the house David and I built together had long stopped feeling like mine. After the officers finished speaking with him outside, they informed him he would need to leave for the evening while the situation was reviewed. It was handled quietly, without humiliation. That is how these matters are done in our town. Dignity is preserved wherever possible. David looked stunned as he collected a small overnight bag. He did not apologize. He did not argue. He simply seemed confused that the world had shifted without asking his permission. When the door closed behind him, for the second time that evening, the silence was heavier than before. My father stayed only long enough to ensure I was safe. He did not lecture me. He did not scold me for waiting so long. He made tea, as he always did in moments of difficulty, and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "You have choices now," he said gently. "You didn't before, but you do now." After he left, I walked through the house slowly. I touched the back of the dining chairs David had insisted on buying from a showroom in Toronto. I stood in the hallway, where the children once measured their heights against the wall. I paused at the office, where I had kept the books for his business for nearly 4 decades. It was never just his business. When we married, David had a pickup truck, a set of tools, and a plan. I had a part-time job at the grocery store and a willingness to work. We combined everything without thinking twice. That is how people of our generation did it. He handled the installations. I handled the invoices. When suppliers were late, I called them. When clients were frustrated, I calmed them. When taxes were due, I made sure they were paid. I learned accounting terminology the way other women learned new recipes. But over time, as contracts grew larger and trucks multiplied, something else grew to a distance. David began introducing the company as my business. At first, I laughed it off. Later, I noticed he stopped mentioning my name at all. At community dinners, he spoke about expansion plans without consulting me. When I asked questions, he would say, "You don't need to worry about that." Yet I worried about everything. When our daughter moved west for work in Calgary, David said she was chasing big city nonsense. When our son relocated to Halifax, David claimed it was too far to be practical. He had begun resenting any independence that did not orbit him. The insults toward my upbringing became more pointed after my father retired from active duty. He returned to our family farm outside town, tending a few acres and helping neighbors with odd jobs. David saw that and concluded he was simply an old farmer. He never bothered to learn otherwise. There were signs I ignored. The time he dismissed my suggestion about a major equipment purchase. The evening he told friends I never understood business strategy. The morning he transferred funds without telling me. Each moment was small. Each one chipped away at something steady. I told myself long marriages require endurance. I told myself pride softens with age. But endurance without respect becomes erasure. The morning after the knock, I woke early. The bruise on my cheek was faint, but visible in the bathroom mirror. I pressed a cool cloth against it and stared at the woman reflected back. She looked tired, not fragile, just tired. My phone buzzed with a message from our daughter in Calgary. "Mom, Dad called last night. What happened?" So he had called her before leaving town. I typed slowly. "We had an argument. It went too far. I'm safe." Within minutes, she called. Her voice carried both concern and something else, relief. "Mom," she said quietly, "this isn't new, is it?" I did not answer right away. "I've heard the way he talks to you," she continued. "We all have." That was the second boundary, drawn not by law, but by truth. Later that afternoon, I met with a lawyer recommended by a friend from church. The office was modest above a bakery on Princess Street. The lawyer, a woman not much younger than my daughter, listened carefully as I explained the situation. "Did you contribute to the business?" she asked. "For 38 years, I replied. "Then you own half of it," she said plainly. The word startled me. I had never framed it that way. Ownership implied authority. Authority implied choice. We reviewed financial statements I had meticulously organized over decades. My name was on more documents than David likely remembered. "You have options," she said. "Separation does not mean chaos. It means structure." As I stepped back onto the street, the winter air felt sharp, but clean. The town moved around me, as it always had, neighbors greeting each other, snowplows clearing side roads, the lake wind cutting through coats. Life was steady here. It did not favor drama. That evening, David called. "I overreacted," he said. "You know, I'd never hurt you seriously." The word seriously hung between us, like a poorly nailed frame. "I won't be coming home tonight," he added. "That's wise," I replied. There was a long pause. "You involved your father," he said quietly. "I involved the law." Another pause. "I didn't know," he said. "That was your mistake," I answered. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table once more. The house still felt unfamiliar, but not hostile. For years, I believed loyalty meant endurance. Now I understood loyalty without accountability becomes permission. The house I helped build stood solid around me. The foundation was not cracked, only the silence had been. And silence, I was beginning to see, is something you can choose to end. The morning after I met with the lawyer, I drove out to the farm. It was late January, the fields covered in a thin crust of snow that glittered under a pale sun. The road leading to the property had not changed since childhood, still narrow, still lined with cedar fences, leaning slightly inward, as if in quiet conversation with one another. People in town called it the old Mackenzie farm. To me, it was simply home. My father was in the barn when I arrived, checking a faulty heater near the tack room. He had reduced the operation years ago. No livestock, now just a few acres of leased land, and a workshop where he repaired equipment for neighbors. Retirement, in his mind, meant choosing which work to accept. He looked up as I stepped inside. "You drove yourself," he observed. "I did." He nodded, as though that answered more than I had said aloud. We sat at a small wooden table near the back of the barn, the same one my mother had once used to sort seed packets in early spring. My father poured coffee from a thermos into 2 enamel mugs. "You met with counsel," he said calmly. "Yes, and I have more rights than I believed." He leaned back slightly. "You always did." For most of my life, my father wore authority lightly. Even after becoming police chief, he never allowed the title to define him at home. He mowed his own lawn. He attended church quietly. He shook hands at community events without ceremony. David saw only the overalls and the calloused hands. He mistook humility for insignificance. "I should have told him years ago," I said, staring into my mug, "about your position." My father shook his head. "Respect that depends on a title isn't respect worth having." We sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. Snow slipped from the barn roof in soft thuds. "I failed somewhere," I said finally. "I let it go too far." He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady. "You endured what you believed was manageable. That's not failure, that's hope." Hope. The word surprised me. He continued, "But when hope becomes harm, that's when it must change shape." I thought about the years of small corrections, small dismissals, small silences. None of them seemed dramatic enough to justify upheaval, and yet, together, they had shaped something hollow. "David didn't know you were still serving in an advisory role," I said quietly. My father's expression remained neutral. Even in retirement, he retained a consultative role within the regional service. Experience does not vanish when the badge is set aside. "He didn't need to know," my father replied. "Your safety didn't depend on him knowing. It depended on you deciding." That sentence settled deeply. We spoke about practical matters, separation timelines, financial division under Ontario law, the importance of documentation. He remained careful not to overstep. Though he had arrived at my door as chief that night here at the farm, he was simply my father. Before I left, he walked me to my car. "You won't be alone in this," he said. "I know. And Laura," he added, placing a firm hand on the roof of the vehicle, "this is not revenge." I met his eyes. It's responsibility. The drive back to town felt different from previous trips. For years, I had driven that same stretch of road after holidays or Sunday visits, returning to a house where tension often waited just beneath the surface. This time, I returned, not with resignation, but with resolve. That afternoon, David requested to meet in a public setting. We agreed to sit in a small cafe near City Hall, neutral ground. He arrived early. I could see him through the window, staring into his cup, as though trying to solve a mechanical problem. When I entered, he stood up automatically. Habit. "I didn't think you'd actually involve police," he said, without greeting. "I didn't think you'd raise your hand," I replied evenly. A flush rose along his neck. He looked around, aware of nearby patrons. Reputation mattered to him. I lost my temper. You dismissed it as nothing serious. He exhaled sharply. It wasn't. I held up my hand gently. It was. Silence stretched between us. You've embarrassed me, he said finally. The statement did not wound the way it once might have. I protected myself, I answered. He leaned forward. We can fix this privately. There's nothing private about harm, I said quietly. He stared at me, as though I were someone unfamiliar. Perhaps I was. When the conversation ended, no dramatic declarations had been made. No shouting. Just a mutual recognition that the structure of our marriage had shifted permanently. That evening, I reviewed financial statements once more. Decades of joint labor lay documented in careful rows and columns. My handwriting appeared in the margins of early invoices. My initials marked tax submissions. My signature rested beside his on loan agreements. I had not merely assisted, I had built. As the sun set over the frozen lake beyond town, I felt a mixture of grief and clarity. Grief for what I had believed our marriage was. Clarity about what it had become. The image of that knock at the door returned to me, but differently now. It was not an intrusion. It was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that harm had occurred. Acknowledgement that silence had ended. Acknowledgement that I had chosen to act. Revenge would have required anger. What I felt instead was steadiness. And steadiness, I was learning, can be far more powerful. When I think back on that evening now, what strikes me most is not the sound of the knock, but the way time seemed to slow between the ringing of the phone and the arrival at the door. 5 minutes is not long. It is enough time to boil water for tea, enough time to fold a basket of laundry, enough time to reconsider a decision and put the phone back down. I did none of those things. After I hung up with my father, I stood in the hallway with the receiver still in my hand. David watched me, his expression shifting from amusement to irritation. What did he say? He asked. He's coming, David snorted. To do what? Lecture me about respect. I did not answer. Those 5 minutes felt longer than the 38 years that had come before them. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the wind brushing snow against the siding. David paced once across the living room. You're making a mistake, he said. You don't involve outsiders in a marriage. The sentence landed heavily. For years, I had accepted that idea without question. Marriage was private. Problems were handled quietly. Appearances mattered. But privacy had slowly turned into protection for him. I didn't involve an outsider, I said calmly. I involved the law. He stopped pacing. You wouldn't. I looked at him and saw perhaps for the first time, clearly, not authority, but fear. Not fear of guilt, fear of consequence. Then came the knock. Firm, even, controlled. David froze. I walked to the door before he could. When I opened it, cold air rushed into the hallway, carrying with it the clean scent of snow. My father stood there, not as Dad in that moment, but as Chief Mackenzie. 2 officers from the regional service stood slightly behind him. Evening, he said. We're responding to a domestic call. The words were official measured. There was no accusation in his tone, only protocol. David stepped forward quickly. This is unnecessary. We had a disagreement. One of the officers addressed him respectfully. Sir, we just need to assess the situation. My father's eyes met mine again. Ma'am, can you step aside with me for a moment? Ma'am, not Laura, not sweetheart, not his little girl. Professional distance. That was how he preserved my dignity. We moved into the kitchen, while the officers remained in the living room with David. My father asked the required questions. Was I injured? Did I require medical attention? Did I wish to press charges? The formality steadied me. I don't want escalation, I said quietly. I want safety. He nodded. Understood. The officers informed David he would need to leave the residence temporarily under domestic disturbance protocol. There was no dramatic arrest, no raised voices, just structure. David protested at first. This is my house, he insisted. It's also hers, the officer replied evenly. That simple statement shifted something. As David gathered a few belongings, he avoided my gaze. Embarrassment colored his movements. Not remorse, embarrassment. When he reached the door, he hesitated. You've blown this out of proportion, he said. No, I answered. It was already that large. The door closed behind him. The house felt unfamiliar in the quiet that followed. Not empty, just newly rearranged. My father remained a few minutes longer, completing paperwork at the kitchen table. His handwriting was steady, precise. Snowflakes melted on the shoulders of his coat. You can contact victim services, he said gently. They're discreet. Support isn't weakness. I nodded. Before leaving, he paused at the threshold. I will always respond when you call, he said softly. I closed the door after him and leaned against it. My hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from release. For years, I had carried tension, like a second spine. I had measured my words, chosen my tone carefully, adjusted myself to avoid conflict. That night, I did none of those things. I made tea, as he had earlier. I sat alone at the kitchen table. The bruise on my cheek darkened slightly in the overhead light. My phone rang. It was our son in Halifax. Mom. His voice was tight. Dad called. What's going on? I explained briefly. There was a long silence on the other end. I've wanted to say something for years, he admitted. The way he talks to you, it isn't right. His words were not dramatic. They were steady, confirming. Later, our daughter called as well. Her voice carried both anger and relief. You don't have to protect him anymore, she said. That sentence stayed with me long after the calls ended. The next morning, I walked through the house differently. I opened curtains that had remained half-drawn. I rearranged a chair in the living room that David preferred, angled toward the television. Small changes, quiet declarations. David phoned mid-morning. I'm staying at a motel near the highway, he said. We need to talk. We will, I replied, but not tonight. His tone softened slightly. You really called your father? I called the chief, I said evenly. Silence followed. I didn't know, he muttered. That was never the point. After I hung up, I stepped outside onto the porch. The snow had stopped. The air felt sharper, clearer. Neighbors moved about their routines. A plow cleared the side street. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Life continued. The knock at the door had not destroyed anything. It had revealed something. Revealed that authority does not belong solely to the loudest voice in a room. Revealed that partnership requires respect. Revealed that I had options. 5 minutes had separated humiliation from accountability. And for the first time in years, I felt not afraid of what might happen next, but ready to face it. The morning after the knock no longer echoed in fear. It began to echo in paperwork. That may sound unremarkable, but for those of us who have lived long marriages, paperwork can feel more frightening than shouting. Documents mean decisions. Decisions mean permanence. I met with the lawyer again 2 days later. Her office overlooked Princess Street, where snowbanks had been pushed into uneven ridges along the curb. Inside, the radiator hummed softly. Nothing about the setting suggested upheaval. That steadiness helped. She placed a legal pad on the desk between us. We'll begin with property division, she said. Ontario law is clear about equalization. Equalization, a practical word, not revenge, not punishment. Equalization. We reviewed the house deed. Both our names were on it. We reviewed the business registration. Though the company carried David's name, I had been listed as co-director for decades. My signature appeared on tax filings, equipment loans, payroll accounts. You weren't assisting, she said plainly. You were operating alongside him. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and grief. For years, I had minimized my role even to myself. What about the retirement accounts, I asked. They are marital assets, she replied. You are entitled to half of what was built during the marriage. Entitled? Another word I had rarely allowed myself. When I left her office, I walked slowly toward the lake. Wind moved across the water in narrow streaks, though it remained partly frozen near shore. I thought about the many winters David and I had walked this path together, speaking about small matters, furnace installations, grandchildren visits, grocery lists. I had believed those quiet walks were partnership. Perhaps they were at one time. David requested another meeting. This time, we sat in the boardroom at his business office, the same table where I had once spread invoices and reconciled accounts, now held a legal folder between us. He looked tired, not humbled exactly, but unsettled. You're taking this further than it needs to go, he began. I'm taking it exactly as far as it needs to go, I replied calmly. He rubbed his forehead. We can resolve this privately. We are resolving it legally. He leaned back, studying me, as though searching for hesitation. You'd really divide everything. After all these years? I held his gaze. After all these years, yes. He shook his head slightly. You never cared about the money. That's true, I said. I cared about respect. The room grew quiet. He opened the folder, glancing through the documents the lawyer had prepared. His expression shifted as he recognized the thoroughness of the records, my records. Decades of careful documentation, neatly organized. You kept everything, he murmured. I always have. For the first time, he looked uncertain in a way that did not revolve around pride. It revolved around consequence. Are you trying to punish me? He asked. I considered the question carefully. No, I answered. I'm refusing to excuse you. There is a difference. Punishment seeks to cause pain. Accountability seeks to correct imbalance. Over the next week, mediation sessions were scheduled. The mediator was a retired judge from Ottawa, soft-spoken and methodical. He explained each step with patience. Division does not erase history, he said. It clarifies responsibility. The language remained steady, neutral. That steadiness mattered to me. There was no spectacle, no shouting, no courtroom drama, just structure. David attempted apology more than once. I lost my temper, he said again during mediation. It won't happen again. It already did, I replied. People make mistakes. Yes, I agreed, and they live with them. At home, I began small changes. I removed his framed business award from the living room wall and placed it in a box. I sorted through joint files. I contacted a realtor quietly to assess market value. Our daughter called frequently from Calgary. Our son checked in from Halifax. Both spoke with a mixture of concern and pride. You're stronger than you think, our daughter said one evening. Strength. The word felt less abstract now. Community response remained understated. In a town like ours, people notice changes without announcing that they notice. A neighbor dropped off soup. A friend from church invited me to coffee without prying. Discretion can be a kindness. David's reputation took a quiet hit. Contractors talk. Bank managers notice changes in signatures. Word travels but gently. One afternoon, David stood in the doorway of the house while I was sorting mail. "Do you want to destroy everything?" he asked. "No," I said softly. "I want to rebalance it." He looked around the living room, as though seeing it for the first time. "You've changed," he said. "I've stopped shrinking," I replied. The mediation progressed steadily. Asset valuations were agreed upon. The business would remain under his management, but I would receive my legal share through structured settlement and partial buyout. The house would be sold with proceeds divided evenly. Nothing dramatic, nothing vindictive. Fair? As documents were signed, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. I felt clarity. For decades, I believed loyalty meant absorbing discomfort quietly. I believed partnership meant stepping back so someone else could step forward. Now I understood. Partnership requires equal footing. The legal mourning did not bring revenge. It brought recognition. Recognition that unpaid labor counts. Recognition that silence is not virtue. Recognition that dignity can coexist with firmness. When the final mediation session concluded, the retired judge looked at both of us carefully. "This agreement is balanced," he said. "Whether the future is as balanced will depend on how you conduct yourselves from here." David did not respond. I did. "I intend to conduct myself with steadiness," I said. And for the first time in many years, I believed it. In the weeks after the mediation concluded, I noticed something unexpected. I was not angry. That surprised me more than the knock at the door ever had. Friends assumed I would be furious. They expected sharp words, visible bitterness, perhaps even satisfaction at David's discomfort. Instead, what settled over me was something quieter, a sense of recalibration. The house went on the market in early March. Snow still clung to shaded corners of the yard, but the first signs of thaw had begun. The realtor walked through each room with a polite professional distance, noting updates and square footage. 38 years, she said gently, as we stood in the kitchen. "Yes. You raised children here." "I did." She paused. "It's never easy." "No," I agreed. "But it's time." David and I coordinated viewings with minimal conversation. Our exchanges were brief and practical dates, documents, signatures. The emotional storm had already passed. What remained was structure. One afternoon, as we sorted through old storage boxes in the basement, David stopped holding a faded hockey trophy belonging to our son. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said quietly. I set aside a box of holiday decorations and looked at him. "It didn't end," I replied. "It changed." He nodded slightly, though I could tell he struggled with the distinction. For years, I had believed revenge meant winning, that someone would have to lose for balance to be restored. But what I had come to understand was that revenge binds you to the injury. Justice releases you from it. The business buyout was finalized by mid-spring. Funds were transferred according to agreement. I opened a new account under my own name, a small but meaningful act. The bank manager, who had known us both for decades, handled the paperwork discreetly. "You've always been organized," he said kindly. "I had practice," I answered. I began looking at smaller properties near the lake. Not grand homes, not statements, just places that felt manageable. A townhouse near Bath Road caught my attention. Bright windows, modest garden walking distance to a library and a community center. When I signed the offer, I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. David called one evening after the house sold. "People are talking," he said. "They usually do," I replied. "They think I'm some sort of monster." I chose my words carefully. "They think you made a serious mistake." Silence followed. "I never thought you'd involve your father," he said again, almost as if the thought still unsettled him. I didn't involve him to shame you, I said calmly. I involved him because I needed protection. Another pause. I'm not your enemy, he said quietly. I know, I replied, but you stopped being my partner. The distinction mattered. In the months that followed, I began volunteering once a week at a women's resource center downtown. I did not share my story publicly. I sorted donations, answered phones, made tea. Sometimes, if someone needed to speak privately, I listened. Listening is not dramatic work. It is steady work. I met women my age who had endured decades of dismissal. I met younger women unsure whether their concerns were serious enough. The language was always similar. It's not that bad. He didn't mean it. It's just stress. I recognized the phrases because I had once spoken them myself. One afternoon, my father visited the townhouse while I unpacked books. You're settled, he observed. I am. He looked around approvingly. It suits you. We sat at the small kitchen table, a different one now, but the ritual familiar. Do you regret it? He asked. I considered the question carefully. I regret waiting, I said, not deciding. He nodded. You chose responsibility, he reminded me. I chose balance, I corrected gently. As spring deepened, David sent a letter. Not a text, not a voicemail. A letter handwritten. He apologized more directly than he ever had in conversation. He acknowledged the harm. He admitted pride had blinded him. I read it twice. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. I forgave him because carrying resentment would have tied me to the past. But reconciliation requires rebuilt trust that I was not prepared to offer. Our children adjusted gradually. Holidays were arranged thoughtfully. Conversations remained civil. Life reorganized itself without spectacle. One evening, as I walked along the lake path alone, I thought about the version of revenge I had once imagined in moments of hurt humiliation, public downfall, sharp words delivered with satisfaction. None of that had occurred. Instead, there had been documentation, mediation, accountability, quiet shifts, and peace. The knock at the door had not destroyed my life. It had interrupted it long enough for me to examine it. In choosing steadiness over retaliation, I found something far stronger than revenge. I found self-respect. The first summer in my new townhouse arrived gently. The lilac bush outside the front window bloomed earlier than expected. The mornings were quieter here, softened by the distant sound of gulls drifting in from the lake. I kept the windows open whenever the weather allowed. Air moved differently in a smaller space, more freely, less burdened by history. I developed small routines. Tea at 7, a walk along the waterfront before the day warmed, volunteering twice a week at the resource center, phone calls with the grandchildren on Sundays. Life did not feel diminished. It felt simplified. David and I finalized the last of the paperwork in early June. The sale of the house had closed smoothly. Funds were distributed exactly as agreed. We met at the lawyer's office one final time to sign a concluding document. No raised voices, no accusations. When the final page was signed, the lawyer looked up at both of us. I hope you each find steadiness moving forward, she said. Steadiness. That word had followed me from the farm to the mediation table to this final moment. Outside the office, David paused. I never thought 5 minutes would change everything, he said quietly. I considered that. 5 minutes didn't change everything, I replied. 5 minutes revealed what had already changed. He nodded, and for the first time, I saw something close to humility rather than defensiveness. I'm sorry, he said again. I know, I answered. And this time, I believed he meant it. We did not reconcile. We did not resume a shared life, but we did reach something resembling mutual understanding. Respect, perhaps, not fully restored, but acknowledged as necessary. Back at the townhouse, I placed the final signed copy of the agreement into a drawer beside David's handwritten apology. I did not feel anger when I touched it. I felt distance, healthy, measured distance. Later that week, I spoke at the resource center during a small evening gathering. Nothing formal, just a circle of folding chairs and a pot of coffee. I did not recount every detail. I did not dramatize. I simply said silence protects the wrong person. A woman across the circle nodded slowly. For years I continued. I believed keeping peace meant keeping quiet. But peace without respect isn't peace. It's fear. The room was still. Calling for help wasn't revenge, I added. It was a boundary. Afterward, one of the volunteers squeezed my hand. "You sound lighter," she said. I was. The knock at the door no longer replayed in my mind as a threat. It had become a marker, the sound of interruption, the sound of law stepping where silence once stood, the sound of a daughter remembering she was not alone. My father still visits on Sundays. He brings tomatoes from the garden in late August and stories about small-town matters that do not require authority, only patience. We sit on the back patio and talk about ordinary things. Ordinary has become precious. Our children call more often now, not because of crisis, but because the air between us is clearer. They no longer sense something unspoken hanging over our conversations. One evening, near the end of summer, I walked again along the lake path. The water was calm, reflecting a pale pink sky. I thought about the decades behind me, the effort, the compromise, the loyalty, the mistakes. I do not regret my marriage. It gave me children. It gave me experience. It gave me lessons I might never have learned otherwise. But I also do not regret drawing a line. If you have listened this far, perhaps you recognize something in my story. Perhaps you have told yourself that raising your voice would only make matters worse. Perhaps you have believed that endurance is the same as strength. It isn't. Strength can be quiet. It can be steady. It can arrive in the form of a simple phone call made with trembling hands. If you ever find yourself wondering whether asking for help is an overreaction, remember, this dignity does not expire with age. It does not diminish after decades of marriage. It does not belong only to the loudest person in the room. 5 minutes separated humiliation from accountability in my life. 5 minutes were enough to remind me that respect is not negotiable. I hope you never need to hear that knock. But if you do, I hope you understand what it means. It means you chose yourself. And that choice is not revenge. It is freedom. If this story speaks to you, if it reminds you of a moment when you stood quietly and decided not to shrink, I invite you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes, a single story can become the knock that changes everything.